The light in the Peak District had a habit of lingering in the valleys long after the sun had surrendered to the horizon. A bruised purple stain that clung to the gritstone walls of Alistair Thorne's cottage. In Edale, the shadows didn't simply fall, they seeped out of the earth, rising from the damp peat and the tangled heather of the moors to swallow the day in slow, rhythmic gulps. Alistair watched this nightly encroachment from his workbench, his fingers stained with the dark, aromatic oils of his trade. He was a restorer of antique telescopes, a man who spent his hours peering through the clouded eyes of the past, polishing the brass of Victorian mariners and recalibrating the lenses of Georgian astronomers. He was 72, a man composed of sharp angles and soft silences, living in a house that smelled of linseed oil, old paper, and the peculiar, metallic tang of cold Derbyshire air. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 5 years, but her absence was not a void, it was a physical presence, a heavy piece of furniture that he had to walk around every time he crossed the kitchen. It was the silence in the hallway that possessed a weight, a density that pressed against his eardrums until he was forced to hum a low, tuneless melody just to break the atmospheric pressure of his own solitude. Today, the loneliness felt particularly acute, a sharp shard of glass lodged beneath his ribs. It was the anniversary of nothing in particular, which was often the hardest kind of day to endure. It was simply a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day where the sky was the colour of a wet slate roof and the wind rattled the sash windows with a persistent, nagging curiosity. Alistair set down his chamois cloth and looked at the instrument before him, a 19th-century Dolland refractor. It was beautiful, its mahogany tube gleaming with a deep, wine-dark lustre, but it was broken. The internal lenses were misaligned, turning the world into a fractured, kaleidoscopic mess. He felt a sudden, inexplicable kinship with the telescope. He, too, felt misaligned. He spent his days looking at the stars or the distant ridges of Mam Tor, seeking a clarity that remained stubbornly out of reach. He lived in the macro and the micro, obsessed with the infinitesimal dust on a lens or the infinite distance of a nebula, while the middle ground, the world of human touch and spoken words, had become a blurred and ghostly realm. He stood up, his knees popping like dry kindling. He needed to package it, not the telescope, but the weight. It was a ritual he had developed in the years since Eleanor's death, a private liturgy designed to keep his mind from fraying at the edges. He called it packaging the clouds. He moved to the kitchen, where a stack of small, brown paper squares sat beside a coil of garden twine. He sat at the scrubbed pine table and took a fountain pen from his pocket. The ink was a deep cerulean blue. He didn't write sentences, he wrote single words: static, echo, dust, salt. These were the ingredients of his loneliness today. The static of the radio he left on to simulate company, the echo of his own footsteps on the stone-flagged floor, the dust that gathered on Eleanor's unopened sewing box, the salt of the tears that came not from grief, but from the sheer, exhausting effort of being alone. He folded the paper squares into tiny, precise origami boxes, no larger than a thimble. He worked with a surgeon's focus, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble. Each box was a vessel, a small, hollow space intended to hold a specific fragment of his isolation. When he was finished, he tied them together with a length of twine, creating a small, rattling garland of sorrows. Outside, the wind had picked up, a restless spirit howling through the clough. Alistair pulled on his heavy woolen overcoat, the one that still carried a faint, ghostly scent of lavender from the wardrobe where Eleanor had kept her sachets. He wound a scarf around his neck and stepped out into the gloaming. The path up toward the great ridge was steep and slick with fallen leaves. The air was bitingly cold, the kind of cold that felt clean and honest, stripping away the layers of domestic stagnation that had settled over him during the day. As he climbed, his breath blossomed in the air, white plumes that vanished almost as soon as they were born. He thought about the nature of clouds, how they were nothing more than water and air, yet they could blot out the sun and weigh down the spirits of an entire county. They were the ultimate containers, vast and indifferent, drifting across the borders of the world without ever belonging to any of it. He reached the summit of Mam Tor just as the last of the light was being extinguished. The valley below was a sea of thickening grey, the lights of the village flickering like embers in a dying fire. Up here, the wind was a physical force, a wall of air that threatened to push him back toward the valley. He stood at the edge of the ridge, the garland of paper boxes clutched in his hand. He felt the absurdity of it. Of course, a grown man, a man of science and optics, standing on a hill with bits of paper tied to a string. But the mind, he had learned, did not care for logic when it was starving. It cared for symbols. It cared for the act of externalization. He held the garland out into the wind. The little boxes danced and jerked, straining against the twine like captured birds. Here, he whispered, his voice lost instantly in the roar of the gale. Take the weight of the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon. Take the sound of the kettle boiling for 1. Take the way the bed feels like a cold continent. He thought of the clouds as a vast postal service for the dispossessed. If he could just hitch his loneliness to the vapor, perhaps it would be carried over the North Sea, dispersed into the Atlantic, or broken apart by the jagged peaks of the Highlands. He didn't want to destroy the loneliness he knew that was impossible, for it was a part of his love for Eleanor. He simply wanted to distribute it. He wanted to make it thin, to stretch it out until it was as transparent as the air itself. He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping his hair into a frantic halo. He closed his eyes and imagined the internal geography of his mind. He saw the rooms of his house, each one filled with a thick, grey fog of memory. He saw himself moving through those rooms, a ghost in a house of ghosts. But then he imagined the windows being thrown open. He imagined the wind rushing in, scouring the corners, lifting the fog and carrying it up, out through the chimney, up toward the stars he spent his life observing. The telescopes he repaired were designed to bring the distant close, to bridge the impossible gap between the human eye and the celestial body. But tonight, he wanted the opposite. He wanted the near to become distant. He wanted his own heart to be a star bright, cold, and millions of miles away from the pain of the present. His fingers were numb, the joints aching with the cold. He looked down at the paper boxes. They were damp now, softened by the mist that was rolling in from the west. They looked fragile, pathetic even. He felt a sudden surge of affection for them. They were the only things that truly belonged to him, not the house, not the telescopes, but these small, manufactured containers of his own endurance. He didn't let go of the string, not yet. He began to walk along the ridge, the boxes trailing behind him like the tail of a kite. He felt a strange lightness in his step. The physical exertion had burned away the lethargy of the afternoon. He remembered Eleanor's laugh not as a haunting echo, but as a sharp, clear sound like a silver bell. He remembered the way she used to package things for the post, her movements efficient and graceful, her knots always secure. She had been the one who kept their lives together, the one who ensured that nothing was ever truly lost. "I'm still here, Elle," he said, and this time his voice felt sturdier. The clouds were moving fast now, ragged shreds of grey racing across the face of a rising moon. The moon was a pale, cataract-blind eye, staring down at the shivering landscape. Alistair stopped at the highest point of the ridge. He untied the twine from his wrist. He didn't toss it. He simply opened his hand and let the wind do the work. The garland vanished instantly. It didn't fall. It rose, caught in an updraft that swept it over the edge of the cliff and into the heart of the mist. For a second, he thought he saw the white flash of the paper against the dark heather, and then it was gone, absorbed into the vast, churning grey of the Derbyshire night. He stood with his empty hand outstretched for a moment, feeling the wind bite at his palm. The weight hadn't vanished. He wasn't so naive as to believe in magic, but it had shifted. It was no longer a stone in his pocket. It was a scent in the air. It was something that could be breathed in and breathed out. The descent was easier. The darkness was total now, but he knew the path by the feel of the stones beneath his boots and the slant of the slope. He felt a peculiar sense of duty to the night. He was an observer, after all. That was his vocation, to watch the light, to measure the shadows, to ensure that the lenses through which we view the world were clean and true. When he reached the cottage, the silence was still there, waiting for him at the door, but as he stepped inside and hung his coat on the peg, it felt different. It didn't feel like a pressure anymore. It felt like a space that was clean and empty, ready to be filled with something else, even if that something was only the sound of the rain starting to tap against the glass. He went to his workshop and switched on the lamp. The light spilled across the Dolland refractor, catching the gold leaf of the maker's mark. He picked up his tools. His hands were steady. He began to work on the internal alignment, his movements precise and deliberate. He wasn't just fixing a telescope, he was reordering his own vision. He thought of the little paper boxes, somewhere out there in the dark, tumbling over the moors, dissolving in the rain, their ink bleeding into the soil. He had sent his loneliness into the clouds, and in return, the clouds had given him back the night. It was a fair trade. As he adjusted the final lens, he leaned forward and peered through the eyepiece. The wall at the far end of the workshop, which had been a blur of grey an hour ago, was now sharp and clear. He could see the individual grains of the wood, the minute cracks in the plaster, the delicate web of a spider in the corner. He sat back and smiled, a slow, creased expression that felt unfamiliar on his face. He reached for the kettle. He would make a cup of tea. He would sit in the armchair. He would watch the clouds pass over the moon, and he would be alone. But for the first time in a very long time, he would not be lonely. The sky was holding it for him, and the sky was vast enough to carry everything. The moon climbed higher, casting their silver sheen over the valley of Edale. High above, the clouds continued their restless journey toward the sea, laden with the invisible packages of 1,000 solitary souls, drifting silently through the cold. Indifferent beauty of the English night. Alistair Thorne turned off the workshop light and walked into the living room, his footsteps echoing softly on the stone, a sound that no longer needed to be drowned out. The house was quiet, but it was a quiet that breathed. He sat by the window and watched the horizon, waiting for the first hint of the dawn that would eventually, inevitably, break through the grey. He thought of the words he had written: static, echo, dust, salt. They were just words now, light as air, scattered across the hills like seeds. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind, feeling the rhythmic pulse of the world, a slow and steady heartbeat that persisted even in the deepest of winters. He was a restorer of telescopes, and finally, he could see. The world was not a fractured mess, it was a series of distances, and he had finally learned how to measure the space between himself and the stars. He fell asleep in the armchair, the ghost of Eleanor's lavender scent wrapped around him like a blessing, while outside, the clouds carried his sorrows away, silver-edged and silent, into the infinite reaches of the dark. In the morning, the valley would wake to a frost-rimed world, the grass crunching underfoot like broken glass. The mist would burn off by noon, leaving the air so clear it hurt to look at. Alistair would wake, stretch his aching limbs, and begin the day. He would polish the brass until it glowed like a fallen sun. He would walk to the village for a loaf of bread and a tin of tobacco. He would speak to the postman about the weather. And every time he looked up at the sky, he would see not just the weather, but a vast, moving archive of everything he had let go. The clouds were his messengers, his witnesses, his silent companions. They were the packaging for the things too heavy to carry, and as long as they drifted, he knew he could keep walking. The gritstone walls of the cottage held the warmth of the small fire he had built, a stubborn defiance against the encroaching winter. The telescopes stood like silent sentinels in the workshop, their glass eyes turned toward the heavens, waiting for the next clear night. Alistair Thorne, the man who peered through time, was finally content to live in the present, a solitary figure in a landscape of light and shadow. Anchored to the earth but with a heart that belonged to the clouds. The silence was no longer a weight, it was a song, low and constant, the sound of a life being lived in the quiet intervals between the stars. And as the moon dipped below the ridge of Mam Tor, the last of the paper boxes dissolved into the damp earth of the moors, leaving nothing behind but the clean, cold smell of the rain and the enduring, magnificent indifference of the sky. The morning arrived not with a shout of gold, but with a gradual, bruised purple light that bled into the valley, turning the frost on the dry stone walls into a crust of diamonds. Alistair Thorne watched the transition from his armchair, his body stiff from a night spent suspended between the world of dreams and the heavy reality of his own bones. The tea in his mug had long since cooled to a dark, talon-stained disk, yet he held the ceramic vessel between his palms as if it still contained the embers of the previous night's epiphany. The air in the cottage was thin and sharp, tasting of cold stone and the faint, lingering sweetness of the lavender water he used to clean the more delicate lenses. He stood, his joints popping like dry kindling, and walked to the window. The moors were an ocean of iron-grey heather and pale, dying grass, undulating under a sky that had finally emptied itself of rain. Somewhere out there, the paper boxes were becoming one with the peat, their ink surrendering to the acidity of the soil. He felt a strange, phantom lightness in his chest, a sensation akin to the moment a diver breaks the surface of the water and realizes the air is not a threat, but a gift. He was no longer holding his breath. In the workshop, the smell was different today. Usually, it was a heavy, suffocating scent of stale grease and the metallic tang of oxidation, the smell of things decaying, and his own desperate struggle to halt that decay. This morning, as the first true ray of sunlight pierced the dusty pane, the room smelled of potential. He ran a finger over the barrel of a 19th-century Dolland refractor. It felt less like a burden and more like a bridge. He thought of the word aperture. It wasn't just a hole for light, it was a choice to let the world in. A sharp, rhythmic rapping at the heavy oak door broke the silence. It was a sound that usually would have sent a jolt of irritation through him, a splinter in the quietude he cultivated like a rare moss. Today, however, it felt like a punctuation mark. He opened the door to find Beatrice Halloway standing on the threshold, her cheeks flushed a vibrant, wine-whipped red. She was a woman of 60, perhaps a few years his junior, with a face like a map of the Peak District itself, all high ridges and deep, laughter-carved valleys. She held a small wooden box under one arm and a thermos in the other. Beatrice lived 3 fields over, a woman who bred border collies and spoke to the wind as if it were an old, slightly senile relative. "I saw the light in your window late," she said, her voice a warm rasp that didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped into the hallway, bringing with her the smell of damp wool and gorse. "I figured you were either wrestling with the heavens or your own ghost. I brought some leek soup. It's mostly leek, but there's enough black pepper in it to wake the dead." Alistair took the thermos, the warmth of it seeping through his skin. "I was just finishing a project, Beatrice, a cleaning of sorts." She tilted her head, her eyes the colour of tarnished silver scanning his face with a disconcerting precision. "You look different, Alistair. You look like someone's finally turned the lamp on inside. Usually, you're just a shadow moving behind the glass." "I think I've just stopped fighting the dark," he replied, surprised by his own honesty. He gestured toward the workshop. "Will you come in? I have the brasses out." They sat in the small kitchen, the soup steam rising between them like a localized fog. Beatrice placed the wooden box on the table. It was mahogany, scarred with deep gouges and missing its brass latch. "This belonged to my grandfather," she said, her fingers tracing the wood with a reverence that Alistair understood in his marrow. "It's a mariner's compass. Not that we've much call for the sea here in the High Peak, but he was a man who liked to know which way he was facing even in his own garden. The needle stuck. Alistair, it just shivers. It won't find the north any more." Alistair opened the box. The glass was cracked, a jagged line bisecting the compass face like a lightning bolt. The needle was indeed trembling, trapped in a perpetual state of indecision, twitching against the copper housing. He looked at it and saw himself the years he had spent shivering in place, unable to point toward any future, because he was too anchored to the magnetic pull of what he had lost. "It's lost its pivot," Alistair murmured, his voice falling into the rhythmic, professional cadence of the craftsman. "The jewel at the center has likely cracked or gathered enough dust to create friction. It's not that it doesn't know where north is, Beatrice, it's just that it's too tired to get there." "Can you fix it?" she asked. "I can clean it," he said, looking up. "I can replace the glass. But the needle, it has to want to swing. I can only remove the obstacles." Beatrice smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "That's all any of us can do, isn't it? Remove the obstacles and hope the wind catches us." As they sat, Alistair found his mind drifting to the clouds he had watched the night before. He wondered if one of his paper boxes was currently hovering over the Irish Sea, or if it had been caught in the branches of a sycamore in the next valley. It didn't matter. The act of sending them had been the repair. He realized that for years he had been trying to fix the telescopes so he could see something far away, thinking that distance would provide clarity. But the clarity was here, in the steam of the soup, in the grain of the mahogany, in the steady, rhythmic breathing of a neighbor who had bothered to walk through the frost to bring him warmth. After Beatrice left, promising to return when the compass was cured, Alistair returned to his workbench. He didn't pick up the compass immediately. Instead, he reached for a small, leather-bound ledger that had sat untouched for 3 years. It was Eleanor's gardening diary. For a long time, the sight of her neat, looping script noting the first appearance of snowdrops or the stubbornness of the climbing roses had been a physical blow, a weight that pressed the air from his lungs. He opened it to a random page in mid-July. "The delphiniums are leaning," she had written. "They need more support than I can give them today. The sky is a terrible shade of blue, the kind that makes you feel like you're falling upward." He touched the ink. It was dry, permanent, a fossil of a moment. He didn't feel the crushing grief that usually accompanied this ritual. Instead, he felt a quiet, profound gratitude. She had seen the blue sky, and she had recorded it, and now he was seeing the grey sky, and they were both part of the same long, unfolding map. He took a pen and, beneath her entry, wrote a single line in his own cramped, precise hand. "The clouds are heavy today, but they are moving. I am watching them for both of us." He spent the afternoon in a state of flow that he hadn't experienced since before the silence had moved into the house. He dismantled the compass with a surgeon's delicacy. He cleaned the tiny brass pin, polished the underside of the needle, and replaced the shattered glass with a disc he cut himself, the diamond-tipped tool singing as it scored the surface. As he worked, he noticed the way the light changed in the workshop. It wasn't static. It moved across the floor, highlighting the dust motes, then the workbench, then the shelves of lenses. It was a reminder that the world was in constant motion, a carousel of light and shadow, and that to try and hold onto a single moment was to try and stop the earth itself. He thought about his daughter, Clara, who lived in Bristol and whose phone calls he had been answering with monosyllables for months. He thought about the way her voice always had a hopeful lilt at the beginning of the call, a lilt that flattened into disappointment by the end. He reached for the phone on the wall, his hand hovering over the receiver. The plastic felt cold, utilitarian. He dialed the number, his heart thudding a strange, syncopated rhythm against his ribs. "Clara," he said when she picked up, his voice cracking slightly like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. "Dad," there was a pause, a heartbeat of silence pregnant with the weight of all the things they hadn't said. "Is everything okay? Is it the pipes again?" "No," Alistair said, looking out at the Mam Tor ridge, where the mist was beginning to coil like dragon's breath. "The pipes are fine. I was looking at the sky, and I thought you'd like to know that the frost is particularly beautiful this morning. It looks like the world has been dipped in sugar." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. You sound like yourself, Dad." "I think I'm getting there," he said, and for the first time, he wasn't lying to her or to himself. "I'm restoring a compass for Beatrice Holloway. It lost its north, but I think I've found it again." They talked for 20 minutes, not about the past, not about the funeral, not about the empty chair in the kitchen, but about the mundane, beautiful details of the present. She told him about the rain in Bristol, the new book she was reading, the way the light hit the Avon Gorge in the evenings. When he hung up, the room felt larger. The shadows were still there, but they were just shadows, the absence of light, not the presence of something malevolent. He returned to the compass. He placed the needle back on its sharpened pivot. For a moment, it wobbled, uncertain, caught in the residual friction of its own history. Alistair held his breath, watching the tiny sliver of steel. Then, with a sudden, decisive grace, the needle swung. It didn't shiver. It pointed, steady and true, toward the invisible magnetic pole that governed the world. Alistair sat back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He looked at his hands, stained with oil and age, and saw them not as tools of a dying trade, but as instruments of connection. He was a restorer of telescopes, a man who helped others see the stars, but today he had fixed a compass. He had helped someone find their way home, and in doing so, he had found his own coordinates in the vast, shifting geography of the English night. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, amber fingers across the valley floor. The clouds were gathering again, thick and woolly, promising more snow or rain by midnight. Alistair didn't mind. Let the clouds come. Let them carry whatever they needed to carry. He had his fire, his soup, and a compass that finally knew which way it was facing. He walked to the window and watched the first star blink into existence above the dark silhouette of the moor, a tiny, piercing light that pierced through the veil of the world, reminding him that even in the deepest dark, there was always something burning, always something waiting to be seen. The kettle's whistle was a thin, silver needle piercing the velvet quiet of the kitchen, a sound that no longer felt like an intrusion but a summons. Alistair Thorne moved with a measured grace, his joints complaining less than they had in the preceding months, as if the act of recalibrating Beatrice Holloway's compass had somehow oiled his own rusted mechanics. He poured the water into a chipped porcelain mug, watching the steam rise in frantic, swirling ghosts before they vanished into the shadows of the ceiling. For a long time, he had viewed his grief as a stagnant pool, a dark, motionless thing in which he was perpetually submerged. But tonight, watching the grey-bellied clouds march over the gritstone edges of the Hope Valley, he saw the wisdom in their transience. They were heavy with the weight of unshed rain, burdened by the moisture they had gathered from distant oceans, yet they did not stop. They carried their cargo until the atmosphere demanded a release, and then they let go, unburdening themselves upon the parched earth below. He took his tea to the window, the glass cold against his forehead. He thought of Elspeth, not the Elspeth of the hospital bed, nor the Elspeth of the quiet, final months, but the woman who used to stand exactly where he stood now, her hands tucked into the sleeves of an oversized woolen cardigan. She had always been a creature of the weather. She had taught him that loneliness was not a permanent state, but a season, and that even the most stubborn fog eventually surrendered to the sun. "I'm folding it up," Elspeth, he whispered to the reflection in the pane, the loneliness, I'm packing it away. He imagined taking the sharp, jagged edges of his isolation and wrapping them in the softest silk of memory, then handing the bundle over to the wind. He would let the clouds carry it over the Pennines, across the Irish Sea, until it was nothing more than a speck of dust in the vast, indifferent blue. It wasn't that he was forgetting her, it was that he was finally allowing her to be a light in his sky rather than a weight in his lungs. In the workshop, the telescope parts lay like a disassembled galaxy on his bench. Tomorrow, he would return to the great brass tubes and the delicate lenses, but tonight, his focus remained on the small, wooden box containing the Holloway compass. It sat on the velvet cloth, a humble thing that held the entire world's orientation within its brass walls. He felt a sudden, sharp urge to walk. Not the hurried trudge of a man seeking to escape his thoughts, but the deliberate stroll of someone reacquainting himself with his territory. He pulled on his waxed jacket, the corduroy collar stiff against his neck, and stepped out into the night. The air in Nether Booth was sharp with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a quintessentially English perfume that spoke of hearths and endurance. He began to walk toward the Packhorse Bridge, his boots crunching on the frost-dusted lane. The village was settling into its evening rhythm, a yellow glow spilled from the windows of the Nag's Head, and the muffled sound of laughter drifted through the heavy oak door. Usually, Alistair would have quickened his pace, shrinking into the collar of his coat to avoid the risk of a sympathetic greeting. Tonight, however, he paused. He watched the light dance on the cobbles and felt a flicker of something that resembled hunger not for food, but for the messy, unpredictable friction of human company. He reached the bridge and leaned over the stone parapet. The stream below was a dark ribbon of motion, whispering secrets to the mossy rocks. Above him, the clouds were thinning, shredded by a high-altitude wind. A crescent moon hung like a silver hook, catching the edge of a stray vapor. He found himself thinking of the word orientation. In his trade, it was a technical term, a matter of degrees and minutes, of aligning glass with stars. But as he stood there, the cold air filling his chest, he realized it was also a spiritual one. To be oriented was to know where one stood in relation to the things that mattered. For months, he had been a ship with a broken rudder, spinning in the doldrums of his own making. Now, the needle was steady. He reached into his pocket and felt the smooth, cold surface of a small stone. He'd picked up a piece of blue john from the local caverns. He turned it over in his fingers, a tactile anchor. He thought of Clara in Bristol, perhaps sitting in her own kitchen now, her heart a little lighter because of a 20-minute conversation about frost and pipes. He felt the vastness of the distance between them, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a chasm. It felt like a bridgeable space, a landscape waiting to be crossed. The clouds were moving faster now, galloping across the sky like pale horses. He looked up at them, and in his mind's eye, he saw himself reaching out and tucking his solitude into their fleecy folds. Take it, he thought, carry it away to where the horizon meets the sea. I have no more room for it here. He turned back toward the house, his stride lengthening. The silence that awaited him, there would no longer be a predator, it would be a workspace. He had telescopes to align, lenses to polish, and a daughter to visit. He had the Holloway compass to deliver, a small miracle of brass and magnetism that had taught him more about himself than any star chart ever could. As he climbed the lane, a fox darted across his path, its tail a brush of copper in the moonlight. It paused for a fraction of a second, its amber eyes meeting his, acknowledging a fellow traveller in the dark. Then, with a flick of its tail, it vanished into the hedgerow. Alistair smiled. The world was full of these small, fleeting connections, these brief alignments of spirit that sustained the soul. He reached his front door and paused, looking back one last time at the Mam Tor ridge. The clouds were nearly gone, leaving a sky so clear it felt brittle. The stars were out in their millions, a grand, silent audience to his small reclamation. He went inside, the click of the latch sounding like a period at the end of a very long, very difficult sentence. He hung his coat, moved to the kitchen, and for the first time in a year, he didn't just sit in the dark. He reached for the switch and flooded the room with light. The kitchen, bathed in the unaccustomed brilliance of the overhead bulb, seemed to recoil for a moment, its shadows retreating into the corners like startled ghosts. Alistair Thorne stood by the switch, his hand still resting on the plastic plate, watching the way the light caught the fine layer of dust on the dresser. It was a cartography of neglect, a topographical map of the months he had spent drifting. He did not look away. For the first time since the house had fallen silent, he found he could endure the sight of his own stillness. He moved to the kettle, the linoleum cold beneath his socks, and the sound of the water filling the vessel was a roar in the quietude of vital, rushing promise. While it heated, he did not sink into the armchair in the corner, the one that had moulded itself to the shape of his withdrawal. Instead, he walked toward the small workshop tucked at the rear of the cottage, a room that had become a reliquary for unfinished things. The air here was cooler, smelling of machine oil, lavender-scented beeswax, and the sharp, metallic tang of brass. On the workbench sat the Holloway compass. It was a beautiful, stubborn thing, its gimbals locked, its needle sulking away from the north. He pulled the adjustable lamp low, its pool of light isolating the instrument from the rest of the world. He took up a jeweler's loupe. Pressing it to his eye, the world vanished, replaced by a landscape of gears and hairsprings. He saw the fault immediately, a microscopic burr on the central spindle, a tiny rebellion of metal that had been enough to throw the entire orientation into chaos. It was a metaphor so heavy he almost smiled. We are all held captive by the smallest of frictions, he thought, a word unsaid. A door closed too firmly, a speck of grit in the machinery of the heart. With a steady hand, a steadiness he hadn't possessed yesterday, he took up a fine-grained stone and began to polish. The sound was a rhythmic whisper, a shush-shush-shush that mimicked the breathing of the house. He worked with a singular focus, his mind no longer darting toward the grey horizons of his grief, but staying here, in the silver-bright circle of the present. He was no longer a man mourning a life, he was a craftsman fixing a tool. There was a profound, quiet dignity in the distinction. By the time the compass needle swung free, finding its magnetic north with a joyful, shivering snap, the tea in the kitchen had gone cold. He didn't mind. He set the instrument down and watched it settle. It was true now, it was aligned. He walked back to the kitchen and found a sheet of heavy cream stationery, the kind Martha had always insisted on keeping in the bureau drawer for proper occasions. He sat at the table and uncapped his fountain pen, the ink pooled on the nib, dark and expectant. "My dearest Clara," he began. The words felt like stones being placed to form a path across a stream. "The frost is deep tonight in Nether Booth, but the pipes are holding. I found myself at the bridge earlier, watching the clouds. I realized I have been carrying a great deal of weather inside me, and it is time I let it pass." He paused, watching the ink dry to a matte black. He thought of her in Bristol, the vibrant, chaotic life she had built, and how he had hovered on the periphery of it like a ghost at a window. "I am finishing the Holloway piece tomorrow," he continued, his handwriting growing bolder, more fluid. "It is a fine instrument. It reminded me that even when we are lost, the north does not move. It is we who must find the courage to look at the needle. I should like to bring it to you, not by post, but in person. I suspect the car needs a long run, and I find I have a sudden, inexplicable craving for the sea air of the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Would next Saturday suit? I have much to tell you, and even more to hear." He folded the letter with precise, deliberate movements, the paper crisp between his fingers. He tucked it into an envelope and wrote her address, that house on Pembroke Road with the blue door he hadn't seen in a year. The house felt different now, The silence was no longer a weight pressing against his eardrums, it was a transparency, a clear vessel waiting to be filled. He walked to the window and looked out toward Mam Tor. The sky was an obsidian mirror, and the stars were no longer cold, distant fires, they were coordinates. He thought of the clouds he had seen earlier, those pale horses galloping toward the coast. He imagined them carrying his solitude away, scattering it over the Atlantic where it could dissolve into the salt and the spray. He felt lighter, a man who had finally offloaded a cargo he was never meant to carry alone. He climbed the stairs to the bedroom. The wood creaking a familiar welcome, he did not reach for the bottle of scotch on the nightstand. Instead, he opened the wardrobe and pulled out his suitcase. It was a battered thing, smelling of cedar and old journeys. He laid it open on the bed, its empty interior hollow of possibility. As he began to pack a wool jumper, a clean shirt, the sturdy boots meant for walking city pavements, he caught his reflection in the dressing table mirror. He looked older, certainly. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by a winter of the soul, but there was a spark in the iris, a rekindling of the pilot light. He thought of the fox he had seen on the lane, the way its eyes had acknowledged him, a fellow traveler. We are all just moving through the dark, he realized, looking for the glow of a window or the steady pull of a needle. He turned off the bedside lamp and lay down. For the first time in months, his thoughts did not circle the drain of the past. They drifted forward, mapping the miles between Nether Booth and Bristol, counting the bridges. Anticipating the moment he would stand on Clara's doorstep and see his own history reflected in her smile. Outside, the Peak District slept under its mantle of frost. The wind sighed through the gritstone edges, a long, departing breath. And in the small cottage, in the room that had once been a fortress of loneliness, Alistair Thorne fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, his heart finally oriented, his spirit at rest, while above him the clouds continued their long, silver journey toward the dawn.